Graham. We are live on YouTube as well. Welcome, folks. My name is Dustin Jones, and you are listening to the PT on Ice Daily Show brought to you by the Institute of Clinical Excellence. It's Wednesday, where we talk about all things older adults, where either myself, Christina Previtt, Alex Sherman, or Julie Brower will take the mic from the MMOA division. It's good to see y'all. Today, we're talking about the three biggest mistakes that you want to avoid when implementing outcome measures with older adults. We may get to four if we have time, but we're definitely going to talk about at least three. Before we get into the goods today, I want to give you a few updates on what's going on around MMOA. Live courses. We've got a pretty busy November. We're going to be in Cheyenne, Wyoming, November 5th and 6th. That course was sold out. We're bringing out another faculty member, so we have a few more seats for that. Then the next weekend on November 12th through 13th, we're going to be in St. Mary's, Georgia, and then Oshkosh, Wisconsin as well. So we'd love to see you all out there. In terms of online courses, Essential Foundations, our last cohort's running right now. Our next cohort is going to be January 4th, and Advanced Concepts, the next cohort's going to be January 12th in 2023. That's kind of crazy. All right, let's talk about outcome measures. Let's talk about some mistakes that we want to try and avoid whenever we're trying to use these with our folks. This is a big area that we talk a lot about in all of our courses, is the importance of an examination, and in particular when we're working with older adults, the use of functional outcome measures. These outcome measures give us an amazing kind of snapshot of how that person is doing in terms of their functional ability, in terms of their independence, and things that we may want to work on, right? It also gives us a good idea of what they may be at risk of. A fall, for example, or rehospitalization, or not being able to maintain their independence. We have a lot of data in the realm of geriatrics to predict a lot of those health outcomes, which can really justify our care and also give us a sense of urgency of this situation is rather urgent. We need to hit this hard. We need to front load those visits. We really need to have a pretty potent intervention rather quickly. So these outcome measures are absolutely huge. We want to use them, but we often see a lot of mistakes in the implementation of these outcome measures. We see these across the board when we're teaching our courses, and we've all made them as well. I think everyone that teaches with MMOA have made these mistakes with outcome measures, and we want to make sure you don't make these mistakes as well, because we have a huge opportunity, and we want to make sure that we maximize that. All right, so the first mistake that we want to avoid when implementing outcome measures is mismatching our measure. Mismatching our measure. What do I mean by that? That is where we may take an outcome measure that we know is a great predictor of falls, or may look at someone's balance ability, for example, and we may give a fairly high-level patient a very easy outcome measure where they end up absolutely crushing it. It's not challenging them whatsoever. We would call this the ceiling effect with this outcome measure. You're not getting a whole lot of information because you're not really challenging that person. You're not really pushing them to their limits. You may get a number and it may be good to go, but it doesn't give you a lot of information of when does their balance start to break down, for example. A good example of this is in the outpatient setting, where we may use something like the Berg balance score, right? In home health, skilled nursing facility, acute care, for example, Berg is pretty pertinent for a lot of folks, but for a lot of community dwelling older adults that are walking in and out of your clinic, really relatively active individuals, the Berg is going to be super easy for these folks. And it's not going to give you a lot of helpful information because it's not going to be challenging. It's not going to push them to their limits. Let's take the opposite, for example. Let's say I'm in home health and I take someone through the mini best test. The mini best test can be a relatively high level test where it's going to be very, very difficult, almost impossible for someone in home health to go through this test. We would call that the floor effect, right? Or the basement effect, if you will. It is way too hard. They're going to fail almost every component, and we're not going to get a lot of helpful information that's going to drive our interventions. We've mismatched our interventions. So we want to try and match our outcome measure to the person in front of us, right? I just gave you one example. There's tons of examples of these. What really becomes apparent is once you run through these outcome measures yourself, you will start to picture a certain type of person that it is appropriate for. So, number one, we mismatch our measures. All right, number two, we get dirty data. We see this a lot with outcome measures, especially in the realm of geriatrics, because these outcome measures are validated in a certain manner, right? If you look at research studies that takes the SPPB, for example, the short physical performance battery test, that says, hey, if this person gets under an 8 out of 12, they're likely on that frailty spectrum. They may be at risk of a fall. They're in somewhat of an issue that we need to really improve their capacity. So there's studies that have looked at the SPPB done in a very particular manner that have concluded that that under 8 out of 12 is that cutoff score. Well, if we're going to say that someone needs our physical therapy services based on that score of the SPPB, you better do the test the same way that it's done in the research study, right? Because you're not going to be able to state this person is at risk of X, Y, and Z if you're doing a completely different test. If you're measuring the gait speed a little bit differently than how it's standardized, if you're counting the reps on the repeated chair stand part of that test differently than how it was standardized. So you need to know the standardization and the steps of these tests. Now, there's a lot of little differences and nuances among these, and we cover these extensively in our modern management of the older adult courses, but this is something you need to be very aware of. We want to have clean data. We want our test and our number that we get from our patient. We want to be able to compare that to these very valuable norms that have been established in cutoff scores. But we also want to be able to run a clean test when we go to do a reassessment, for example, or to check if there's any change. We talk about this in almost every ICE course of how we can build the bike or show our value very, very clearly. If I do the test on day 1 differently than the test on day 14, for example, that's a whole different test. That's a whole different outcome. You're not able to make a clean comparison to show the direction this patient is going. Are they improving or are they declining? You have no freaking idea because you ran a different test. All right. You'll hear this in lumbar spine, and they speak to this really well in cervical spine as well. No different in the realm of geriatrics. We want to have clean data. We need to run the tests the same way every time. All right. So, number 1, we mismatch our measures. Number 2, we get dirty data. We want to stop that. Number 3, we don't celebrate normal. Here's what happens, right? You learn, let's say, about the timed up and go, right? They get up, they walk about 10 feet or 3 meters, they turn around once their feet cross the line, then they sit down. What's the number that you remember? Almost all of y'all that run tugs, you probably remember one number to establish if someone is at risk of falling. And you're probably thinking it or saying out loud 14 seconds, right? 14 seconds is the most common cutoff that you're going to see. And many of us have that burned into our memory. And what happens is I may run that test, I do that tug, and then if they get under 14 seconds, it's easy to think, oh, I checked the box, I ran my tug, they're not at a high risk of falling based on this score. And you may not even say that out loud. You may just say something like, cool. All right, now we're going to do whatever next test you're going to do. We need to realize that that is valuable and that is worth celebrating. That someone can do a faster than 14-second tug is awesome. And let's bring attention to that. Hey, Betty, you just did 12 seconds on that timed up and go. Based on these norms of folks kind of in your age group, you're absolutely crushing it. Awesome job. This is really good. Now, let's also take a deeper dive into your balance. Let's do this test over here. We want to build folks up because if you think about what they've experienced through the healthcare system, what have they been told in almost every healthcare interaction? The most prominent things that are shared with them is what's wrong with them, the issues they have, what is out of the norms, what do we need to focus on, what drug do we need to take to bring those lab values down. They are very aware of what is abnormal. They're not very aware of what they're doing well at, of what is normal. And we have an opportunity to do that all the time. But I'll speak for myself. I typically I'm trying to find positive tests, if you will. I'm trying to find issues. I'm trying to find something to work on and focus on that versus finding what is good, what is normal. And we can celebrate that. And that's very valuable for these folks. All right. So number 1, we mismatch our measures. Number 2, we get dirty data. Number 3, we don't celebrate norms. And we have time for 4. Let's go for 4. We fail to clearly demonstrate change, right? If you take any ICE course, particularly the spine course, the spine division, we'll talk for about 2 hours on building the bike. How can we clearly demonstrate our value and that we are actually changing someone's life for the better? And hopefully it's something related to something they care about or that primary driver. Usually it's painful symptoms in physical therapy. In geriatrics, it's usually related to function and performance. Now, in geriatrics, what we're often doing, we're doing the outcome measure day one, maybe day two. Then we're doing our thing, maybe for a few visits. If you're in home health, you may be going for a few weeks before you do your reassessment, right? You run that same test and hopefully you have a clean comparison because you standardized, you wrote down how you did that test before. And then we have an amazing opportunity, an amazing moment where, let's say on eval, you did the tug. Betty did it in 15 seconds. She's at a risk of falling. It was slower than 14 seconds. And then you do the tug at reassessment, and she does it in 12 seconds. It's very easy to do something like this. Oh, cool, Betty. About 3 weeks ago, you did that same test in 15 seconds, and we did in 12 seconds today. That's 3 seconds better. Cool. Let's do this other test that we need to do. Right? How does that land? How does that speak to someone like Betty? Does that get her excited? Does that demonstrate that she's actually progressing? No, not at all. Not at all. So instead of doing that, what if we do something like this? Holy crap, Betty, when we did this 3 weeks ago, you did that in 15 seconds. I was kind of concerned about your risk of falling. In just 3 weeks, you did that in 12 seconds. I know that doesn't seem like a big improvement, but you improved by 20% in 3 weeks. That is insane. You can look at it on this graph here 20% improvement. That's awesome, Betty. That was only over 3 weeks. Imagine if you keep this going over a long period of time. Who knows where you're going to end up in a year, Betty? Let's get to work. Big difference, right? Huge difference in the value of that 3 seconds. That's an opportunity. We waste it all the time. Let's not waste that. That is our ability to demonstrate change, that you are valuable to that person. And the clearer we can make that, and also the sooner we can make that in our courses of care, the better off we're going to be. We're going to win Betty over. She'll be our patient for life if you're able to demonstrate that type of value to that person. But don't expect Betty to be able to realize that, right? That's not her job to realize that she's improving. That's our job. And we can do a lot to make that very, very clear. All right. Top four mistakes. I gave y'all an extra one. Number one, we mismatch our measures. Number two, we get dirty data. Number three, we don't celebrate norms or what is normal. And then number four, last but certainly not least, we fail to clearly demonstrate change, and therefore we fail to clearly demonstrate our value. All right, these are all things that I've done and every MMOA faculty member has done as well. We hope you avoid these mistakes. Y'all have a lovely rest of your Wednesday, and I'll talk to y'all soon. See ya.